Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Today I'm back with a follow-up to a recent video I posted on Odin and death, and I wanted to talk about an associated topic, Odin and wisdom. We saw that Odin's own sacrifices of his eye and of himself were in order to achieve wisdom, and he also, of course, shares quite a bit of wisdom with us humans, at least in the form of the poem Hávamál. Now, Hávamál is a subject I've talked about many a time on this channel, and of course I've translated it twice. My translation of the Poetic Edda includes a translation of Hávamál into sort of normal, written, contemporary English, but also into the cowboy Hávamál, or my grandfather's voice. So it's a text I've thought about a lot, and a text that means a lot to me. And since we've been on kind of an Odin kick here, I thought I would talk about some of the kind of meta details of Hávamál that I think are interesting. Now, there are actual scholars of the proverb, of wisdom literature, people who study this in particular. One of their great masters was Archer Taylor, who was fond of the quote by Lord John Russell that a proverb is one man's wit and all men's wisdom. So typically the kind of wise advice you see in a poem like, say, Hávamál is going to be stuff that's actually kind of commonsensical. It's not necessarily revolutionary new thoughts or stuff that you couldn't possibly have thought of. It's just that it's put in a particularly memorable, witty way. One characteristic of many proverbs that the wise advice stanzas in Hávamál have is that they're often phrased in the negative. Think about English proverbs and idioms that have to do with intelligence and how often they're framed with negative rather than positive vocabulary. He doesn't have enough sense to come in when it rains. Well, okay, but is it a compliment to say that somebody has enough sense to come in when it rains, right? That sounds like a very minimalist compliment. Same thing, you know, I can't trust him further than I can throw him. Well, is it a compliment to say I can trust him as far as I can throw him? Probably not. Spineless as a worm. Do people say spineful as a whale? I mean, that's something with a lot of spine, but nobody says this kind of thing. Proverbial and idiomatic and trope type language, these things tend to get phrased in negatives. And we see that a lot in Hávamál too. Just as a brief sample, think about stanzas 21 to 22. I'll just give you my normal English translation. Even cows know when they should go home and leave behind the fields, but an unwise man does not know the measure of his own appetite. Well, it's not necessarily a compliment. You're not necessarily wise if you do know the measure of your own appetite, you're just unwise if you don't. A stupid man and an undisciplined one laughs at everything. He hasn't learned a lesson that would do him good. He himself isn't flawless. Well, all right, but you're not necessarily a wise man if you know that you're not flawless. So these phrases in the negative tend to kind of reinforce that it's almost litotic. It's saying, you know, this is the opposite of wisdom, and it's sort of educating you by sort of inviting you to kind of laugh at the stupid a little bit, I think. And often these things are introduced with or introduces conflicts with a kind of they-say sort of frame. Hávamál has this, for instance, with, you know, there's less good than they say in alcohol for human well-being. Now, you may notice a lot of these same characteristics of proverbs or wisdom literature show up in some of our best tweets, right? Tweets are often phrased in kind of negative framing, and often they take things that are kind of normal, everyday wisdom or experiences, but they put them in a particularly witty way. One of my very favorites is by Indu Pillai 01. How powerful is darkness that light must flee at that speed? Right, well, we've all thought, I'm having a bad day, or something like that. But to take some memorable factoid from science, the speed of light, and to turn that into a comment about how darkness seems to overcome light no matter what, you know, that's memorable. Or I think this account is dead, but Random Antics had a tweet, the best revenge is living well, so I really need to know what the second best revenge is. You know, that's well done as both a tweet and as proverbial wisdom. You're taking a common idiomatic phrase about the best revenge is living well, subverting it in a way that's actually fairly commonsensical. How is living well really the best revenge? And it's saying, well, okay, what's the second best revenge? Because I'm never going to live well. All right, this may be a little bit tendentious, but I think that it's interesting that you can see similarities in the way that tweets are phrased and the way that something like the wise advice of Hávamál is phrased. All right, a little more serious. Think about where you turn for wisdom in your life, right? Not just in literature and not just in your family, but in both. It's often geared toward the old. So in my family, I wouldn't call my dad dumb at all. He's a smart man, but it feels strange to me, even though a lot of advice he might have given me over the years, a lot of tips or whatever might be very practical and intelligent. The word wisdom doesn't leap to mind. But then I also don't think of him as an old man. My grandfather, however, I do associate with words like wisdom and wise. Although when I told him that in the last month of his life, his cryptic response was jackass wisdom. I think he meant the animal, not something you would call a jerk. Well, if he had jackass wisdom, I wish more people had jackass wisdom. Anyway, but think about it in literature too. The old tend to be those that are dispensing wise advice. Yoda is 800. Obi-Wan is a gray-bearded man. Dumbledore, Gandalf, gray-bearded men. Even Rust in True Detective, when he's older, has facial makeup that indicates that he's kind of old, getting into his 40s or 50s maybe. We associate people that have lived longer with being wise, and who is older than, and still alive, than a being such as Óðinn, who killed the earliest living being. He's old enough to have killed the earliest thing that was alive. We also associate wisdom with the school of hard knocks, with people who have been around the corner and really had trouble with it and really, lived to the hilt and lived hard. Rust from True Detective would be another good example. My grandfather would be another good example. He had a hard life, and that imputed a lot of wisdom to him and me from the way that he had overcome his problems. And of course, when you think about the fact that Hávamál probably isn't originally one poem, it probably is assembled out of several different poems, the inclusion of the story of Óðinn sacrificing himself to himself in Runatal makes a lot of sense as being included in Hávamál with Gestaþolter, the just random practical advice that it seems like, because it's establishing his credentials as someone who has suffered, right? Who has suffered more than a god who has killed himself and sacrificed to himself by hanging and spearing himself? So building on these comments about characteristics of Hávamál as wisdom literature, it's worth pointing out that I think that much like the parallels between the crucifixion of Christ and the sacrifice on the tree of Óðinn of himself to himself, much like I think those parallels are overplayed, sort of overblown, because similar themes, similar events are going to do similar descriptions. I mean, two men hanging are both going to be very hungry, very thirsty, and they're probably going to scream. I think that the supposed parallels between Hávamál and other wisdom literature around the world are exactly that. They're parallels. They don't necessarily mean that Hávamál or Norse society more broadly is being influenced too much by the outside world's specific ideas of wisdom. The Bible is often adduced as an example of a book of wisdom literature that might have influenced Hávamál. And yes, there is potential for that influence to have happened, but I find that the most striking parallels really are just parallels of wisdom that any two cultures would have, right? I mean, old, cynical men are going to kind of talk the same way, no matter if they're, no matter what continent they're from. So to pick a particular example, I like Ecclesiastes a lot. And I do find a lot of parallels between Ecclesiastes and Hávamál, but I don't think that Hávamál is actually necessarily influenced by Ecclesiastes. I just think that these are two wise old men who have come to similar conclusions about human life. Compare Ecclesiastes 1:18 to Hávamál 55. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. Hávamál 55, you should be only a little wise, never too wise. A wise man's heart is seldom glad if he's truly wise. So similarly, two men who have thought quite a bit about How to Be Wise, have also found that being wiser has not made them happy, and that in fact being wiser might make you less happy. Here's another parallel, Ecclesiastes 2:16. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever, seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man as the fool? So similarly, Hávamál has an emphasis on death as a fairly egalitarian force. Think about Hávamál 70. Better to be alive no matter what than dead. Only the living enjoy anything. I saw a rich man's house, but it was on fire, and he lay dead outside the door. Here's another Ecclesiastes parallel for you. Ecclesiastes 2:18-19. Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me. And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet shall he have rule over all my labor wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This is also vanity. Hávamál 40. Do not be so sparing in using your money that you don't use it for your own needs. Often what you save for your children will end up in the hands of your enemies. Many things will go worse than you expect. So once again, we have a parallel of cynicism, not necessarily a parallel of a strong particular image. Remember that proverbial or wisdom literature is every man's wisdom and one man's wit. The wisdom is much the same. Now, what would make me think that there were influence one way or the other would be if there were a particular image, a particular analogy or something like that that was used in both. But if you look at wisdom literature all around the world, look at Confucius. Look at the instructions of Shuruppak, the oldest known book in the world from Sumeria. Look at the instructions of Ptah from Egypt. I think that's still one of the 5 oldest books in the world. You will see many, many parallel ideas. For instance, Ptah emphasizes that a belly may show that you are not as wise as you like to present yourself as being. Hávamál has a very similar comment. The instructions of Shuruppak has, well, it compares untrustworthy things to untrustworthy equids, which Hávamál certainly does in Óðinn's love advice. So like that's actually kind of interesting that those are similar images that come up, but no one would seriously argue that there's Sumerian or Egyptian influence on Hávamál. Rather, I think that what we're looking at is currents of wisdom that sort of make similar ripples in the sand of wise men's minds the world over, no matter the culture of their origin. Well, I hope this has been a somewhat interesting discussion for you, and I hope that if you've enjoyed these videos, that you'll check out my more than 250 other videos on my channel, most of them made in my beautiful Rocky Mountain homeland of Colorado and Wyoming. I also am supported by Patreon donations. All of my Patreon supporters have become a wonderful community to me, both on Patreon and in our Discord forum, and I will be thanking some of them at the end of this video, as I have in many of my recent videos. I have translated the Poetic Edda, as I mentioned in this video, and I hope you'll check that out if you haven't yet. The Cowboy Hávamál, the appendix to that, is probably my favorite thing I've ever done. And I also have videos about that, so I'll link some of that stuff on the end screen. For now, from beautiful Wyoming, I'm wishing you all the best.